I absolutely love movies about Jewishness. And on this channel, I love exploring what it means to be a Jew. And movies are such a great tool to do that. That's because the category movies about Jewishness has such a wide array of topics. And also, these movies have such a range from how they treat these topics, from really silly to very serious. And so, about a year ago, I decided to take this seriously to look at Jewishness in film. And here together, we've started a film club, which we call Yiddish Kino Club, where we went through a bunch of these movies. And over the past year, we've done about a dozen movies or so, and a couple of explorations on themes that come up across many movies. But the truth is that behind the scenes, I've actually watched a ton of movies about Jewishness over the past year. The number is close to 50 movies. And so, as we round the corner into year number two, I thought I would take this opportunity to talk about the movies that I watched this past year. I think the best way to kind of go through this is for me to rank them on a tier list. And that way, I'll be able to give you a quick synopsis and my opinion as we put it together on this ranking system. Before I jump into the tier list, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. If you're new on this channel, my name is David, and here on this channel, we explore Yiddishkeit, what it means to be a Jew. And I personally like to do that by looking at Jewish history, Jewish culture, and Jewish art, like movies. All right, so let's take a look at my screen here. You'll see that I created 5 categories, and I want to jump to the second one first. These are the classics. These are the movies that you definitely heard of, you most probably watched, or at least you know the story, and they also have very strong Jewish themes in them. The third category are good recommendations. They're like the classics, except less well known, but I would still highly recommend them. But the top category, I'm reserving for the ones that are just like the all time legendary films. These are the movies that have so much power to them. They hold so much energy and emotion and art. And these are just exist literally in a category of their own. Okay, the next category, number 4, we have junk food. These are movies that are not so serious, but they're still so fun to watch. They're kind of like a guilty pleasure. So we'll put them at the bottom. And finally, we have the movies that are kind of totally trash. Now, I have to be honest and vulnerable for a second, which is that it's really hard for me to talk trash about movies in public. I feel like I'm always supposed to be polite and not say anything negative. However, sometimes there are movies that are just, well, really poorly done. They do not do a good job of portraying Jewishness. They could really boil Jewishness down into a caricature and really without any substance to it. And so when we come to movies like that, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to put them into total trash. So let's jump into the first movie on the list. We have A Serious Man. This movie is a really interesting movie. It's kind of like a cult classic for certain people, myself included, and other people in my life. You know who you are. The movie is about a man named Larry who begins to go through all these different challenges, and he keeps on asking, why is Hashem making him suffer? And he goes to different rabbis to try to get answers, and there's all these events in his life which are giving him little hints about the right way to go through these challenges. To me, when I first watched this movie, I was blown away by the fact that Larry refers to God as Hashem, which is the term that I used when I was growing up to describe God. And so when I first watched this totally blew me away. Since then, I've seen other movies using Hashem, but this one was the first for me. So it holds a special place in my heart. So I think I'm going to have to put this into the legendary category. All right, next up we have American Pickle. This is a really funny, silly movie about a man who lives in a shtetl, comes from the shtetl to America in the early 1900s, works in a pickle factory, and one day falls into a giant barrel of pickles and gets brined for 100 years. He then wakes up and meets his great-grandson, which is played by the same actor, and they have this funny fish out of water story, or pickle out of barrel story. It's all about this tension of tradition versus modernity, and it also explores the themes of processing grief and loss. This movie I think I would put under good rec. It's a light movie. It's easy to watch, but it's also kind of silly. So I think it's a good recommendation, but I don't know if it's a classic. Alrighty, next up we have a really interesting, weird, dark movie called The Believer. It's about a yeshiva student who leaves the yeshiva. And when the movie opens, we already meet him after he leaves. And he has a lot of resentment to the way that he grew up. And that eventually becomes radicalized into anti Semitism. And he joins this group of neo Nazis and he begins to antagonize the Jews in his community, leading all the way to this plot that they have against the Jews. And we get to this moment where he has to decide, is he going to go through with the plot or is he going to stand in the way of it or some other option entirely? It's a really dark movie. The climax happens on Yom Kippur, which is also really interesting that it uses Yom Kippur as a way to explore this darker side of Jewish identity and this tension. I think I'm going to put this movie under junk food. It's honestly kind of a strange movie, but there are certain moments that did resonate with me. For example, the ending shot really, really stuck with me. Okay, next up we have The Brutalist. This is such an interesting movie, which actually came out this past year. It's quite a long movie, it's almost 4 hours, and the big theme is architecture. I love explaining it to that people like, oh yeah, I saw a 3 hour movie about architecture. Makes you sound very pretentious. It helps separate the nerds from the non-nerds. Most people, when they hear that, they're just like, what? How do you even sit for a 3 hour movie? Who cares about architecture? But there's a lot more to it, obviously. The story is about an architect who's Jewish who survives the war, comes to America, and then he meets a rich benefactor, someone who sponsors his project, as he works on this building, this community center in Pennsylvania, and makes it in the style of brutalist architecture. But there's a lot of Jewish themes that are explored, particularly this theme of immigration, integration, as well as Zionism. It's a question of, is it possible to be a Jew in the Western world, this idea of a Jewish homeland and the Jewish return to Israel? And there's a lot of different views that come from the characters in this movie as they explore this throughout the story of this architect trying to integrate into America. I think I'm going to put this movie under good recommendation. I feel like it's on its way to becoming a classic, but it's not there yet. It happens to be a very dark movie and not so family friendly. So, not everyone's going to enjoy this movie. So I don't know if it's quite a classic, but it's definitely a really intense movie. I've seen it a couple times since it came out last year, and there's just so much there. Next up, we have The Chosen from 1981. This is a really interesting movie because it explores the differences between different types of Jews, different sects or denominations. There are two main characters, and one of them is Hasidish. He comes from a Hasidic community, and he is the son of the Rebbe, the leader of that community. The other boy is more modern, and his father is a college professor and an author, a journalist, an ardent Zionist, but also a biblical critic. And so we get to see how these two very different but distinctly Jewish views clash over several topics, including Jewish identity, processing grief, and Zionism. I think I have to rank this movie as legendary because you would not believe how many different people know this movie. It still shocks me for some reason when the randomest people in my life that I would never expect to have seen this film, it comes up in conversation and they say, oh yeah, I love that movie. And they quote me a line or a scene and something that spoke to them. And it still blows my mind. Like, oh my God, everyone has seen this movie. So yeah, it's definitely legendary. All right, next up we have an interesting movie called Crossing Delancey. It's an 80s rom-com, except the big twist is that this couple is set up by a shadchan, a marriage broker. Both characters live a pretty modern lifestyle. However, the question is, can they find some sort of way to balance their Jewish identity and their modern identity? We explore that through their romantic misadventure, if you will. I personally love this movie. I've seen this movie so many times. And I think I would put it under the classics. I feel like a lot of people have seen this, especially since it's an older movie. So it's had a couple of generations of people that have seen it. Next up, we have probably the most interesting film on this list, which is the Dbook. This is a Yiddish film that was made in Poland in the 1930s, just right before World War II. The movie is based on a play that was written by a Jewish playwright right after World War I. So it really captures this intense Jewish folk feeling that was going on in the shtetls at the time. It was made into this really interesting Gothic style film. The movie's about this boy and girl, Hanan and Leia, who are in love with each other, yet Leia's father wants her to marry the son of a rich man. And Hanan, who is this scholar and mystic, he basically makes a deal with the dark side in order for his soul to connect with the soul of the one he loves, Leia. And so there's this scene where Leia is under the chuppah, the wedding canopy. She's about to get married, and she begins to speak in this strange voice, which we later learn is Hanan's soul speaking. And she says to the person that she's supposed to marry, "You're not my husband. I can't marry you." And we realize that she's possessed by the spirit of the boy that she was in love with. And the rest of the movie goes through this process where they take her to this great rabbi who tries to exorcise the spirit, the Dbook, and to go through all the details of why he was able to do that. If you've never heard of this story before, the first time you hear it, your reaction is probably like, what the heck is this story? It is so strange and so weird. But as soon as you dig just a little beneath the surface, you begin to see that it is filled with meaning. And the deeper you go, the more there is. So this movie is incredibly deep. It's also had several generations, especially when it first came out, was incredibly popular. So I think I should put this under the classic. Next up, we have an interesting movie called Everything is Illuminated. This is a story about a young man from America who is a little eccentric. He has this compulsion to basically collect things and put them into Ziploc bags and store them in his house. And he becomes interested or obsessed with the story of how his grandfather survived World War II. And so he returns to Ukraine and hires this tour guide to take him and see the town and hopefully meet the people who saved his grandfather. And so he teams up with this young Ukrainian slash Russian man and this man's grandfather as they go through the back roads of Ukraine to try to find this village. And the story starts off as really weird and kind of like a comedy. And then about halfway through, it takes this pivot and just gets extremely sad and dark as we explore the themes of grief and loss. And there's also this idea of dealing with Jewish identity in the face of that loss. This one's a tough one. I don't know if I'd put it under recommendation or junk food. I think I'd put it under junk food because it does start off quite silly and it does kind of go off a cliff halfway through and towards the end. So this movie's not for everybody. It's really fun to watch. I've seen it multiple times and it's always enjoyable, especially since I have a Russian background. And so I really was able to understand the Russian humor in this film as well. Next up, we have a movie that came out pretty recently called The Fabelmans. It is a fictional autobiography of its creator, Steven Spielberg, which explores the life of a Jewish boy as he's growing up and the dynamics he has with his family and at school and society at large. And although his life gets pretty chaotic and there's an element of anti Semitism as well that he experiences, ultimately the thing that holds him together is his love of filmmaking. And there's these beautiful scenes where he's literally cutting together a film, like with scissors and tape and the whole nine, and putting together these reels. As someone that puts together videos for YouTube and for my day job and for my family and friends, it was something I really related to and loved seeing this element of vintage filmmaking. Incredible. I think I'd put this movie under good recommendation. Perhaps will become a classic one day, but for now, I think that's where it belongs. Okay, next up we have Fiddler on the Roof. I think right away this movie just belongs under classics. But let me tell you a little bit about the film. The film comes through the perspective of a man named Tevye, who witnesses changes that come to his little town, his shtetl. These changes come in the form of more and more modern marriage practices that each of his daughters has. And we can see how it bends tradition until finally the third daughter essentially breaks tradition and causes Tevye to really have this existential moment. And the movie ends with more changes that come to Tevye's town when the Jews are expelled and have to leave and go to the big city, and Tevye goes to America. I think the part that a lot of people remember are the songs. That's definitely something I heard a lot growing up. People singing the songs, If I Were a Rich Man or Tradition. Those are definitely the two songs I heard a lot growing up. Also, so many times in popular culture, there's Tevye references or Fiddler references. And so this movie definitely holds such a large place in our popular culture. So without a doubt, it belongs in the classics. Alrighty, next up we have probably my favorite film ever, which is Hester Street. Hester Street is about this couple, Jake and Gittel, and their journey through America. Particularly, it focuses on the story of Gittel, who arrives to America where her husband has been for a few years already, and Jake has shaved his beard, taken off his yarmulke. He's not religious anymore. And he's in this pursuit of a purely American identity, which he calls a Yankee identity. While Gittel is still very much adapting and is trying to parse through which of the traditions are meaningful to her and which are not, and trying to come to some sort of middle ground without abandoning everything. we really see a very, very deep exploration of tradition versus modernity and Jewishness in America. I love this movie not just because it explores these themes so deeply, so profoundly, but also the vibe of this movie. Sometimes I wish I was like born on the Lower East Side during this time period, even though I know that it was incredibly harsh to something so incredibly romanticized in this film that really, really speaks to me. So this movie definitely belongs in the legendary category. Even though it's not super well known, it definitely deserves a lot of attention. Next up, we have a really interesting movie that's quite recent. It's from around 10 years ago or so, called Ida. This movie is about a young woman who is in a convent about to become a nun, and she is told that her one surviving relative from the war is still alive. And the story takes place in 1950s Poland, and turns out that this woman is Jewish. They go to find the remains of their family that died during the war so they can bury them in a Jewish cemetery. The story is so profoundly deep and dark as it explores this theme of death, of trauma, of processing all of that in the aftermath of these events. And the movie is filmed in black and white, so it has this really old feel to it. And it just makes you sit there with so much feeling, so much emotion. And you really have to do a lot of the processing yourself. Like, this movie does not spoon feed anything to you. It's definitely a movie I would recommend if you're looking for something real, something very powerful. Okay, next up we have a movie called Keeping the Faith. The story is about this man who is a rabbi in a Reformed temple, and his childhood friend is non-Jewish and becomes a priest. And they reunite with this old friend of theirs, this woman who the rabbi then falls in love with. And this idea of a rabbi falling in love with someone who is not Jewish is a classic trope of Jewish stories. And in fact, recently there was a show called Nobody Wants This that explored a very similar theme. I think overall the film had a lot of potential, but it really chose to go down the comedy route and not be very serious. And also, the characters really become like a caricature of what it means to be a Jewish rabbi without actually exploring the deep emotions. It kind of feels very surface level and there's not much there to it. So I'm not sure if it belongs in junk food or in total trash. I think I'm going to be kind to this film and put it in junk food, but it's right on the edge. Next up, we have a really incredible film that I recently spoke about on this channel called Left Luggage. This movie takes place in Antwerp in the 1970s, and it follows the story of this woman named Chaya. Now, she is Jewish, but her parents are non-observant. All the adults in this film went through World War II, and so the children in this film, Chaya, who's a young woman in the story, all the people she's interacting with went through this serious trauma of World War II and the anti-Semitism that went along with that. So she's really parsing through all these different perspectives. The name of the film comes from the fact that her father is obsessed with this suitcase full of items that he packed away at the start of the war and buried somewhere in the city. And he's obsessed with trying to find it. And this idea of trying to dig into the earth to try to find the remains of your past rings true with the themes of Ida as they look for the lost remains of their family in that movie. Also, Chaya begins to work for a Hasidic family as a nanny, and we begin to explore the same themes of grief and loss and processing the trauma of war, but through a more religious perspective, as we explore the tension between the Hasidic father and his young son Simcha, who has some disabilities that he's working through, and the father is not able to handle it because of the trauma that he's still holding on to. And it's such a deep and beautiful and really, really dark movie. For now, we're going to keep it in a really good recommendation. Next up, we have a really amazing movie called Liberty Heights. I like to think of this movie as the Jewish Bronx Tale. It covers so many themes. A lot of them have to do with Jewishness, particularly the father is involved in running numbers and this idea of exploring the Jewish involvement in the underworld, especially in the earlier parts of the 20th century. The older son explores this theme of Jewish looks and Jewish identity, and particularly dating a non-Jewish woman and fitting into the non-Jewish world, especially the elite. The younger son explores a theme that's very similar to the love story in A Bronx Tale, where he becomes interested in and eventually begins to date this girl who's African American, and both sets of parents are not eager for them to be dating, and we explore this idea of tribalism as it pertains to Jewishness and also the civil rights era. This movie overall is pretty well known and has such strong Jewish themes, and it's also really beautiful, like incredibly beautifully shot film. So I think this movie belongs under classics. Next up, we have a really interesting indie film called Lies My Father Told Me. This is a really interesting story. It's told through the perspective of a child, and it explores this child who grew up with his grandfather. And so there's a lot of tension between tradition versus modernity, where the grandfather is the traditionalist and the father is the modernist. And there's all these explorations of the meaning of religion, of life, of loss, and also of standing up for yourself. We also get to see this side of the grandfather that isn't strictly religious, but also touches on this folk aspect of what it means to be Jewish. And I really like this movie because of how authentic and folksy the grandfather really is, and it has this really warm, wonderful feeling to it. And so I would put this under good recommendation. Next up, we have a really interesting movie called Loving Leia. This is a Hallmark rom com, which basically means it's really silly and the story is absolutely preposterous. The story is about something called Yibum, which, in case you don't know, is an idea called benevolent marriage, which is where if you have two brothers, one of them gets married and dies before he's able to have children. The second brother has this responsibility based on verses in the Bible to marry the widow of his brother. Now, today, this is actually not practiced. There's something called chalitza, which is a ceremony that makes the brother who's supposed to marry his brother's widow, makes him exempt from doing that. But in this movie, instead of doing chalitza, they actually follow through this benevolent marriage, and it turns into this really interesting love story. So you can already see that the premise of this film is really silly and way out there. However, I really enjoy this movie despite that. And so I think I'm going to put this under junk food, but I just really resonate with a lot of the characters. And there's just like a lot of silly Jewish humor in there. So I'm going to count this under junk food. Next up, we have a movie recently covered here on the channel, which is Minasha. This film takes place in Brooklyn around the 2010s, and it's about a father who is trying to raise his son, is really struggling to do that. As a result, he runs into tensions with his family, with his community, and even with his own son, and explores this idea of processing grief of the fact that he lost his wife, and also about what it means to be a man, the role in a community, and both in the role in a personal life, how to be responsible. I think also what's really interesting about this film is that it's a movie that's basically entirely in Yiddish, and the main character and most of the supporting characters are Hasidish, which is really unique thing for a film that went pretty mainstream around 2017. And so it also helped open the door for other movies like that. For those reasons, this movie ranks pretty high for me. I don't know that it's a classic, but I definitely recommend this film if you want a really beautiful window into the Hasidic world. Next up, we have Schindler's List. This is a really dark and beautiful movie. It explores the life of Oskar Schindler during World War II. This was a man who starts off as a war profiteer. He is trying to make money off the backs of slave labor during the war, and he realizes that Jewish labor is the cheapest, and so he starts a factory using Jewish labor. Eventually, he goes through a transformation where he doesn't just see the Jews as slave labor, begins trying to actively rescue Jewish people around him through his factory. And by the end of it, he's truly a changed man. This is obviously a very famous movie. The score is something you probably recognize. I think this movie belongs under classics. Next up, we have a really interesting short film that came out this past year called Shidduch Crisis. And I had a chance to see this live when it first released, and also a bunch more here on YouTube. It's a really interesting film about this woman who is struggling to find clarity in her dating life as she navigates the Orthodox dating system. And again, it really resonated with one of the themes in Crossing Delancey, this idea of a matchmaker kind of imposing oneself into one's life and putting this pressure to decide whether someone is right for them or not in a case where someone isn't ready to make that decision. I really appreciated this film because it felt very human to me. It really resonated with a lot of my own experience and the experiences of so many people around me. In fact, I literally recommended this movie to basically everyone I knew that was going through some version of the events happening in this film or could relate to it in some way. And so this movie belongs in the category of good recommendation. Next up, we have one of the weirdest movies. I don't get this one. It's called Tango Shalom. It's about this man who is struggling to pay his bills and support his family and realizes that he can make a lot of money by winning a dance competition. And so he decides to enter this dance competition with this woman in order to dance the tango. The problem is that this man comes from the Hasidic community in Crown Heights, which means that he's not able to touch another woman other than his wife. And so they have to come up with a very inventive way for them to dance together. The way these characters are portrayed are so stiff and so fake and inauthentic. The Jewish characters themselves are essentially a caricature of a caricature. Like, I don't know any Jew in the world that even comes close to describing this type of Jew. The most obvious example is just the way they're dressed. Like, I don't know of any Jew in America that has both a beard, curly payas, and wears like a Borsellino style hat. It's either beard and payas and a Hasidic style hat, or beard and Borsellino but no curly payas. If you type in like Jewish man into stock images, you're going to get like that kind of Jew, like wearing the Borsellino and the curly payas. That just doesn't exist in real life. This movie looks like it went to stock images to understand what being a Jew is. And so that really bothered me. So I'm going to put this movie under total trash. And what's crazy about this is that this movie won like 25 film festival awards or some craziness like that. And I just don't get it. I don't know what they saw. I think the only way to appreciate this movie is if you basically get really high and watch it like a stoner comedy. But otherwise, I don't know what people see in this movie. All right, so as I get to the end of the movies I put up here, let's look at a couple more. I have this next one called To Dust. It's a really interesting movie. It's about a man who loses his wife at the start of the film. He then gets these disturbing visions that he associates with his wife's soul being in pain, and he becomes obsessed with the decomposition of his wife's body. And in order to speed it up, he joins forces with this college professor who goes with him on this crazy adventure to study the decomposition of human and animal bodies. And it happens to be a pretty interesting scientific exploration, but in terms of Jewishness, it's a little bit out there. It's similar to the Dbook in the sense that it also deals with this idea of the departed and the soul still affecting those that are living. In fact, in the film To Dust, they play a clip from the Dbook in order to give some context, which I thought was really cool. Overall, the film is kind of out there and a little silly and a lot of dark humor in there. So I think I'm going to put this movie under junk food because even though I don't necessarily recommend it, I have seen it a bunch of times. So I kind of love this movie. Next up, we have a movie I recently covered on the channel as well in honor of Passover, and that is When Do We Eat? And that is because this entire movie takes place at a Passover Seder. It's about this kind of dysfunctional family where every single person who comes to the Seder has their own agenda, their own entire world going on, including one of the sons becomes a Chabad Chassid. At one point, one of the sons drugs the father with some ecstasy, and the father starts getting high and seeing these crazy visions, and the whole Seder just goes way off the rails. I think even though this movie is really silly, ultimately it belongs on the good recommendation list because I literally did recommend this to a bunch of people. And finally, the last one on this list is Yentle. It's a really interesting movie. It's about this young woman who doesn't have a mother and just a father, who is a Talmudic scholar and a teacher. This woman doesn't really know how to cook. She doesn't really do the girly things that she's supposed to do in her female role in the shtetl. And instead, she is really good at studying the Talmud. And eventually, when her father dies, she decides to dress up as a boy and go to a Talmudic academy, a yeshiva. And I kind of like the premise of this film. I thought it was interesting, but I really did not like the film itself. I thought it would be cool to explore the gender roles, especially in the shtetl, and also explore this idea of Talmud study and being a Talmudic scholar. The problem is the two big things I disliked about this film were the way the characters interacted with each other. They're very touchy in a way that they did not need to be. And it just felt really off putting in a very awkward way. And second of all, the depiction of what it was like to be a yeshiva student was really off. As someone that actually went through the yeshiva system, which is essentially the same system that happened in the shtetl, obviously I did it here in Brooklyn. The movie totally missed the mark on that. I know that a lot of people love this movie. This movie is kind of a cult classic for some people, but for me, I genuinely disliked it, and so I have to put this one under trash. If you're someone that thinks that Yentle is actually an incredible film, I would love to hear why you think that. But until then, this is my opinion on some of the movies I've seen this year. As I mentioned, I have watched so many Jewish movies in the past year. I could literally do a whole part two. I'm curious what you thought of the movies I ranked here, especially if you've actually seen them. I want to hear about your opinions. If you found this video interesting, then I think you're going to find some of the other explorations on this channel interesting as well. On this channel, we like to explore the experience of Jewishness, and we use movies as a way to do that, as well as Jewish history, culture, and art. And so if this sounds interesting to you, then you, my friend, you're in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to this channel.